Hello there, Bill Mumy in California. It's nice to talk with you.
Well, thank you kindly. It's nice to be with you from across the planet.
Let's start at the start. Now, we mentioned off air that your father was a cattle rancher, but not involved in showbiz, but you chose to be a child actor. So can you just let us know how that inspiration came about?
Sure. What happened was in the late 1950s, I was about 4 years old and I broke my leg, and so I was in a cast for a couple months and I couldn't really run around and play with my friends or anything, so I stayed inside most of that time staring at television, and it was really watching Guy Williams as Zorro and George Reeves as Superman, both caped adventurers, that just resonated incredibly strongly within my young little mind, and I started bugging my parents to get me inside the television set so I could be an adventurer like Superman or Zorro. My mother had worked at 20th Century Fox Studios for about 11 years before she married my dad as a writer's secretary, and my grandfather had been an agent in the 30s and 40s and had handled a lot of directors and writers, but some actors. Boris Karloff was one of his clients. He got him the Frankenstein audition and negotiated those deals for him. From my mother's side of the family, they weren't intimidated by or pressed with show business, and I really wanted to do it. I was an only child, and my dad was pretty much felt that as long as my mom was with me and I was having a good time, I might as well check it out. So we did, and you can't escape your destiny. It just seemed to be the right choice, and I worked very prolifically for a long time. Got an agent, started booking gigs.
And obviously the agent was good, and you were good because you were absolutely prolific.
Yeah, I worked a lot, and it was nice to be able to work in so many different styles all the time as opposed to just being on one series forever. You know, I got to be the scary kid in the Twilight Zone, then I'd be like the nice kid on a Western or the sick kid on his hospital show. Movies and TVs and Disney things and Twilight Zone. I mean, I worked a lot, and it was always a lot of fun, actually. I had a good time. Kids have great imagination. If you're open to somebody directing that imagination, I think it's a pretty natural thing for a kid to do, play, act. And I was good at it. I mean, everybody's got their gifts. Some people can throw a baseball really fast and really straight. Some people can act. I don't know. It just seemed to be the right road for me.
Well, obviously you have the artistic gene because you can act, you can sing, you can play all the musical instruments and write, and you've got the artistic gift, which must have come somewhere down the line in the family.
I guess so. I'm not sure, you know. I don't really have any other family members, and my folks are long gone, and they weren't actors, so I do have a lot of creative energy, though. Definitely.
Just been listening to a few albums. I mean, you've been basically releasing one album a year in the last 15 years.
It equals out to just about that. I came of age in the 60s, which was certainly a period of time when some of the best musicians and songwriters and groups of all time were putting out at least 2 albums a year and doing world tours and making films, and it didn't seem at all unusual to get a couple albums a year from anybody in those days when I was a teenager and stuff. Today, people tend to take several years in between. It's been 2 years since my last album was released. But yeah, I write a lot of songs. And I have a recording studio in my house, and I like to play instruments, so I'm happy to keep putting them out.
So where did you video the 10 Days video that you've got up there on YouTube? Was that in your studio?
No, that was not. That was over at Christian Nesmith's and Cersei Link's studio. I was a guest on a podcast show that they do once a month a couple weeks ago, and I was fortunate enough to play a handful of my songs with their band, and 10 Days was one of them.
Let's get back to your child acting. How were you schooled?
Every minor has to go to school when they're working on a film or a television show, and you have to get in 3 hours of schooling a day. It has to be done within a minimum of 20-minute increments. It all has to be wrapped up by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes on shows like Lost in Space, where I had a really, really heavy workload, it was always tough. That was always the hardest part for me. Memorizing let's say a 5-page scene and then going on the stage and blocking it and getting ready to shoot it. And then they'd rush you off to the trailer outside, stick you in school for 20 minutes, and you had to completely change your consciousness and start thinking about whatever, history or math or something, right? And then get yanked out of the trailer and back into the stage and try to remember where you were supposed to hit your mark and all that stuff. The school stuff was the only part that was kind of frustrating.
So who were your friends? Were your friends your TV colleagues, or were there school kids that you were friends with as well?
I still have the same friends I had when I was a little kid. My friends were the people that lived on my street or down the block, and certainly on Lost in Space I was with Angela Cartwright all those years, and we're still very close, and we're collaborating on a couple of projects together right now. This is the 50th anniversary of Lost in Space this year, and there's an 18-disc Blu-ray box set coming out from 20th Century Fox with just a ton of bonus material that I've produced and written and helped to create, and Angela and I have actually 2 books coming out this year. A fantasy novel we've worked on for years called On Purpose that should be out in a couple months, and then a Lost in Space memoirs book of unseen behind-the-camera photographs and stuff that we're working on right now.
And it's only 18 years ago since you lifted off in the Jupiter 2.
Oh, right, 1997. Yeah, more like 50 years ago. But yes, the Jupiter 2 left in 1997.
You came back just in time for your first solo album, yeah?
Yeah, excellent. Very well. You've done your homework. Yes, that's right. Which, of course, featured a song called The Ballad of William Robinson. It's kind of a legit folk song about a space sailor's story went astray.
Well, one of your albums, I was listening to it, and you did Long Black Veil, and you did Early in the Morning.
That album that you're referring to, Thank You Kindly, it's called, is a Kingston Trio tribute record. So I was covering a dozen of my favorite Kingston Trio songs, and at some points I was trying to really emulate their sound. Other tracks I was putting a fresher spin on things, but yeah, that was a Kingston Trio homage.
So did they originally do Long Black Veil as well?
Yeah, I think they were the first to record that song, 63, on an album called New Frontier. The band did it like 6-7 years after.
I'll just mention a few titles now. One film was one of the very first films I saw on TV in the 1970s, and I loved the star of this show. He was a very, very funny man. He died relatively young. Dick Shawn, The Wizard of Baghdad. And this was your first credit. Is that right, Bill?
Yeah, that was the very first feature film I was in. I only worked a day or two on that, and that was done at 20th Century Fox. Yeah, I played a young Aladdin selling lamps. I don't remember a whole lot about that, except I played a young Aladdin, which is kind of funny because, you know, I'm a very fair-skinned, freckle-faced, red-headed, blue-eyed kid.
Yes.
And I guess I was playing a young little Arab or something.
Did you ever see Dick Shawn do one of his shows?
No, but he died on stage. That's about as dramatic as you can get, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't know he was dead. They thought it was an act.
Right. It's morbid and it's sad and everything, but it's also pretty cool. As a performer, if you can say, well, I'd just like to die on stage. I don't mean to make fun of it, but it is pretty cool in a macabre way.
So, Bill, they probably didn't use this language back then, but you were the go-to kid. If there needed to be a kid in a TV show or a movie, I said, Billy, Mumy, he's the one to get.
Yeah, I worked a lot. I mean, in those days, it either kind of was me or Ronnie Howard, not necessarily in that order, that booked most of the work for the categories that we were properly cast in. Ron's done okay.
Yeah, Ron's done quite well himself, hasn't he? He's
done quite well. He's always been a really good guy and a hard-working guy. I'm looking forward to seeing the documentary he's putting together on the Beatles.
So tell me, Mumy, what ethnicity is that family name?
It's Earthling. It's human.
I was hoping for something a bit more specific.
I think it's what we call in the United States Pennsylvania Dutch, and I think that it probably goes back to German heritage, something like that. I don't really know. My dad was born in California. My dad was born in 1904. I mean, that's a long time ago. His father was born in Ohio, and then I think I've got a book around here somewhere that goes to his father being born in Ohio before that. So I don't really know. We're all just earthlings. We're all just humans. We ended up in California, that's all I know.
Yes.
Could be a lot worse.
Bill, I'm going to ask you, recently on TV was A Ticklish Affair. That was quite cute. That was very cute, actually.
I haven't seen that in probably close to 50 years. Shirley Jones is still a really good friend of mine. A pretty good friend of mine. I won't say really good, but, you know, I see her a few times a year, and she's just a great gal, and her family and I are friends. And I had such a huge crush on her when I made that movie. She was in her 20s. I was hopelessly in love with her.
And, of course, you toured with son Sean Cassidy.
Oh, yeah. I was rhythm guitar in Sean Cassidy's band at the height of his teen idol days when he was selling 10 million records a year. That was a magnificent, wonderful, wonderful experience. It was like being in a Hard Day's Night. It was a very good band made up of some really fine studio and group musicians, and we were playing sports arenas to 15, 20,000 people every night, and because of Sean being teen idol, it was just screaming little girls. I mean, from the beginning to the end, they just screamed and cried for him, and oh, it was so much fun. And because he had somewhat of a squeaky clean image, we weren't hassled into the towns and venues that we were at. We were pretty much given carte blanche, and it was a very, very enjoyable tour, 1978.
You did a film which I remember vividly as a kid called Dear Bridget.
Loved that film.
You were a lucky little boy there. Meet Bridget in her prime.
Yeah, I was the first American actor to get a on-screen kiss from Bridget Bardot. That was 1964. She had just turned 30. And, of course, spending 3 months working opposite Jimmy Stewart, really great. What a treat for me. What a great man. Yeah, I like that film a lot. I have nothing but pleasant memories of that. Every time I see that, it brings a smile to my face.
I've got to mention Lost in Space, of course. That's probably your most iconic role, and it was on a channel here called Channel 10. It was on 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the I think it was on the 60s. I'm a bit too young for the 60s, but I remember vividly watching it in the 1970s, and I think every boy loved Lost in Space. But I tell you, Bill, if the episode didn't concern you, the robot, and Dr. Smith, somehow I was just less involved, shall I say, as a kid.
Well, there were, 83 or 84 episodes to watch, and most of them did revolve around those characters heavily. But I love Lost in Space, and I think Lost in Space ran in Australia without a break, longer than just about any other television show. I think it ran for something like 35 years without a break.
Yeah, that sounds right, because it was always on at 5 o'clock, even into the 80s.
Yeah, it started in 1965, and I think it went 30-some years. But the Blu-ray's coming out in September, and they just look unbelievably great. They're like pristine. Oh, my dogs are barking. I've got 4 dogs.
And we get any deleted scenes or anything like that there as well, Bill?
Oh, there's tons of that have never been seen before. One of the things that's very special to me is in 1980, I wrote a script that was meant to be a television movie of the week that resolved Lost in Space, and we do a full cast performance of that as a bonus bit, which is very cool. And there's just countless cool bonus bits that I'm sure anybody can look up on the internet now and see the promotional things of all the stuff that's going to be included. But anybody who's a fan of Lost in Space will really enjoy the Blu-ray, because the shows just look 3D. They look so sharp and beautiful. And the music is great. John Williams wrote our themes, and it's been a lot of fun re-exploring the old stuff in such pristine condition.
There's so many classic episodes. And look, you know what they say today? It's the golden age of TV with all these brilliant shows. But Bill, I don't think there's a TV show that can do what Lost in Space did, because it was a drama, and then it turned into a comedy, and then it turned into and then it turned into an action adventure. I don't see Breaking Bad or Mad Men even daring to attempt something like that.
No, there are definitely different artistic periods, so to speak, of Lost in Space. You have to remember, this was the mid-1960s, and it was that very brief pop art period in global culture. When we went into color, that's when the Yellow Submarine was coming out, and The Summer of Love, 1967, the whole planet was changing, and the culture was shifting, and fashion was changing, and music and all the arts were experiencing a renaissance and great new freedom. And Lost in Space represented those changes from season to season. It's interesting to look back on it now with that history in mind of what was going on around the country or around the world when we were filming the series. And it certainly does have absolutely specifically different styles from season to season.
Whatever it is, it has become an iconic series, because, I mean, Irwin Allen, he didn't stop trying. Land of the Giants, Voyage to the Bottom, but none of them could capture the magic of Lost in Space.
Well, we had a really good cast, and we all bonded like a real family, and it was a happy place to go to work, and everybody got along really well, and glad I was a part of it. It's interesting because, I did 3 Twilight Zones, the original classic series, and some people find that to be iconic. Some people find Lost in Space that way. Some people think Fish Heads, the song that Barnes & Barnes did in a video that we did back in the late 70s, was kind of iconic. So it's very flattering and pleasing to have your work resonate so deeply and so differently in so many different arenas. You never know when you're working on a project. Sometimes I've worked on some things where I thought, wow, this is going to be really great. And when it was all said and done and put together and edited, and it was not really great. It was, ooh, this one's kind of a turkey. And there are other times when you just, no, I don't know if this guy knows what he's doing. You know, I'm going to hit my mark and read my lines and hope for the best. And then something comes along and you see it put together and you go, wow, that's really cool. So I don't think actors, when you're working in television or film, I'm not talking about the stage, but when you're working in television and film, you're really just a chess piece that the director moves around as he wants and the editor cuts into places that they want, and you're scored with music, and there's so many variables that are out of an actor's control when it comes to film. You never really know what you're going to get.
And the last film I just quickly want to mention is that you had a fabulous career as a child actor, but you also got to work with one of America's most loved directors. I think every Hollywood, look, even Spielberg and people like that, I think want to be this guy deep down, and that's John Cassavetes. And you, of course...
yeah, I worked with John Cassavetes on the first of 2 Stanley Kramer feature films that I did, and that was way back in 1962, I think. A Child is Waiting with Judy Garland and Burt Lancaster and Jenna Rollins. That was a hard film to work on. That was a difficult film. It was not a very comfortable place.
I suppose Judy would have been having her issues back then as well.
She was so sweet, but she was very, very fragile. My perspective was that of an 8-year-old boy who was waiting around to hit his mark and do what he did. But I recall there were a lot of times when she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to come out of her trailer or whatever. And John Cassavetes was very emotional, not a mellow director, so to speak. He got very emotional. That was a weird film. I haven't seen that one in a long time.
All right, Bill, let's get on to your fabulous music career. Lost in Space ends. So were you already playing music?
There's actually several episodes of Lost in Space, going back to the very first one, where Will Robinson guitar and singing. There's like 3 or 4 episodes where Will was out there being a little space folk singer. I started playing when I was 10, and I started writing songs when I was 11. By the time I was 15, or certainly 16, I was part of a band, and I was recording and performing regularly. And making music was probably the more important side of my life, although I always have continued to act, and I enjoy that. But it's different. Both rewarding, and one is more financially rewarding than the other, but I think I've always been more passionate about following my personal muse musically than I have been as memorizing someone else's dialogue and delivering it with believability, which I, again, like to do, and I think I'm okay at it. But getting a song out of nowhere and seeing that song through to a final recorded track, or performing that with a group, or even a solo acoustic performance in front of a live audience, that's really satisfying. It's fun. I mean, I really enjoy recording.
And that band, would that have been Redwood?
Yeah, Redwood was my first professional band, and I was in that band for almost 6 years. Redwood album out on iTunes right now from our older material that actually I'm very proud of. Every time I hear that, I go, wow, that was a good little band. 16 through 21. Long time ago.
Yeah.
But it's funny how certain things seem to hold up.
And then Barnes and Barnes came about. So would that have been straight after Redwood?
Well, Barnes and Barnes was around even earlier than when we first started releasing our records, but Barnes and Barnes was always like a little hobby, fun, jam, kind of spontaneous combustion. Let's record some goofy songs, the two of us. Robert Hamer and I are Barnes and Barnes. And Robert and I both like quirky kind of old comic books and Three Stooges and just Zap comics and things. And Barnes and Barnes was a way for us to release some extra energy musically and then put these novelty lyrics, play these characters behind them. And then when Fishheads came out, it became a huge, quick, global novelty hit, mostly because of the Dr. Demento radio show, but then Saturday Night Live ran our video. And it became a cool thing, and Barnes & Barnes has ended up making, over the years, 9 albums.
I'll tell you my little story here, Bill. In California or Los Angeles, you don't really have pub trivia. That's where you sort of go to the pub and you play these trivia games as teams.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, my cousin did that here in about 1990. He made up a team. His name was Peter, so he called it Peter's Pirates. Anyway, the next week he didn't show up, and I sort of took over and I said, I'm not calling this Peter's Pirates. And so what name would you think that I named our team? Maybe a Roly-Poly?
Fishheads.
Yes, the Roly-Poly Fishheads, and we played for about 3 or 4 years, and we either won or came second. So I've got all these trophies on my mantelpiece. It says says Roly Poly Fishheads champion
Wow.
1991.
We're very connected here, aren't we? That's cool. That's very cool. Well, listen, Fishheads has been very good to me. Homer Simpson sang Fishheads on an episode of The Simpsons, and it's been in a lot of different commercials and film projects over the years. And yeah, we've done really, really well off that funny little song, and I still think it's a pretty unique, kooky little thing that makes me smile.
You hit the zeitgeist again there, Bill, with that.
Yeah, we're just Dada-ish.
Now, look, I've got a listing, and I think I've managed to find all the Barnes & Barnes albums. Vu Baha. What's a Vu Baha? Am I saying it right?
Vu Baha is our first album. Vu Baha means like ciao or aloha. Works both ways.
And Luzentine?
Yeah, Luzentine. Luzentine is an unachievable object that you desire.
Code of Honor?
Yeah, Code of Honor is exactly that. It's Lumanian spelling for an album about living your life with a code of honor.
Well, you fooled me with the K and the V there.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do, make things as difficult as possible for you.
Op, bop, a chop.
That's our last album. We hadn't made a record for about 16 years, and we got back together and made Op, Op, a Chop. Yeah, Op, Op, a Chop basically means... It means you're withering into old age.
Oh, great. Speak for yourself there, son.
Yep.
One of our previous guests was a guy called Roger McGuinn here, Bill. Now,
cool.
And I gather that you're a fan because there is a fantastic song that you've done when Roger was Jim. You've got a bit of that Birdsy guitar in there.
It's an absolute Birds tribute track. It's never been released because it was absolutely meant and designed and recorded as a Birds tribute. It's a Rickenbacker 12-string. It's a Gretsch Tennessean like Crosby played. It's a Fender Telecaster with a B-bender like Clarence White played. I approached the Fender bass and the drum set a la Chris Hillman and Mike Clark. And yeah, I mean, that song was really simply an homage to the Byrds. I loved the Byrds. They were one of my very favorite bands as a teenager. I went and saw the Byrds many times. So yeah, that song is also about the 60s. It's also nostalgia for that time. But yeah, I never released that. But a lot of people have picked up on that track and have enjoyed it. I hope McGuinn has seen it or heard it. I would hope he would get a smile out of it, and he gave me so much pleasure over the years as a performer, and I always liked McGuinn. So yeah, I would like him to hear that. You know, he doesn't tell me if he did.
Now, Bill, as I mentioned before, that you have been quite prolific since your first solo album, Dying to Be Heard, and 10 Days, and you gave yourself a task.
With this particular record, it was really an experiment. I call it a record, but not a record, but it was an experiment. I was in a bit of a funk, and I said to myself, I'm going to mandate that I go into the studio, because it's in my home. I go into the studio every day for 10 days. No breaks. I'm not going to go in on Sunday or anything. It was mandated I come into the studio every day for 10 days. And every day I write from scratch and record and complete a song. There was no end goal. There was no like, I'm going to end up with an album, or I'm going to end up with 3 songs I like, or I'm going to end up with 2 or 1 or 10 or whatever. It was just a way to change my headspace and see what happened. And once I committed to the project, I have strong willpower, and I wanted to see it through. And as I said, I refused to say, well, let's see what I have in my lyric book, or let's see, maybe that bridge that I wrote a couple months ago, I can take that. There was a hard, fast rule that I would not refer to anything that I had bubbling around musically or lyrically before. I just had to cut a song a day. That's exactly what I did. And when it was finished in 10 days, I stepped away from it for a while, and then I started to listen to it again, because it was mixed and everything. It was a completely, this is it, I got 10 days to do this. And I thought, this is a strangely cohesive, stripped down, kind of a sloppy record. It's different from any other album I've ever made. I think subconsciously there is a thematic thing that runs through it that I'm just now starting to really recognize. Usually when I make a record, an album, I have quite a variety of tones. I have a lot of different instruments that I apply. For this project, I had 2 guitars, 1 bass, 1 drums, 1 my drum set, and the same keyboards that I've always had. That was it. Not a lot of layering. There's not a lot of overdubbing. And I mean, of course, there's overdubbing because I played everything, but there's not a lot of sweetening. It's a very rough record. I mean, if you're going to write and record and mix a song a day, you can't be overly ambitious. But it's a valid art piece to me, and I hope people will enjoy it. That's all I can say. Some albums have great designs, like they want to be a big politician. An album, this is a big album, it wants to be president. And other albums have smaller goals. They just want to be a good bartender or something. And I think this falls into more of the, like, I'm a good bartender album, as opposed to Overlord of, your id. But it's certainly cohesive, and it came out in 10 days as one piece, and yeah. I'm very interested in hearing what people think about it.
Bill, does that mean that your next album is going to take 3 years to make and you're going to have the Los Angeles Philharmonic and 5...
Well, to tell you the truth, I started an album a year and a half ago as a band with Vicki Peterson from the Bangles, her husband John Cowsill from the Cowsills, and he's the Beach Boys drummer and singer for 14 years, and Rick Rosas on bass, who was Neil Young's bass player. And we went into the studio and laid down 10 tracks. And we were just starting to sweeten those tracks. It was very hard to get us all, and everything was done live in terms of the four of us in the room at the same time. 1, 2, 3, 4, let's go and lay down these tracks. And then everybody had their tours, and so we would come back to sweeten and add to those songs in between everybody's gigs when we could. And Rick passed away very suddenly, completely unexpected, out of the blue on November 6th. Of last year. And I started this record on November 16th, 10 days after he passed away. And I think that that's what this record really is about. We will finish that album, which will be much more ambitious. That group record will get finished, and it will get finished this year. I don't know if it'll get released this year. But the record with Rick's, bass tracks and me and John and Vicki, that'll be coming next.
That's very sad to hear.
It was a pulmonary issue. But nonetheless, that was the catalyst for this record, really, was having this project that I was really, really passionately involved with and very happy to be part of a group because, as you pointed out, over the last 18 years or so, I've released a lot of solo records. And most of those records have been solo records in the truest sense of the word. Most of them are just me playing all the instruments. Some of them have other players, but most of them are truly solo records. So when I was part of this band again, and we were really laying things down live together, I was so happy about that. It was really great to be part of a unit and not just have hired musicians working for me. And that can be great, too. I've certainly enjoyed the process of gathering some players together to make an album with, but it's different when they're working for you, as opposed to you just are bringing a song or half of a song to these other guys, and they all find their parts, and it falls into place, and it's better than you hoped it might be. And that's where we were at. That led to this.
Good luck with both albums. So hopefully the new one will be out sometime this year.
Who knows? I hope so. Like I said, we've got those tracks, and we have to finish them.
You've got to keep this consistent track record of yours, Bill. One after the other.
I'll do it for you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Somebody who named his trivia team the Roly-Poly Fish Heads. Whatever you say.
Speaking of your music, you've worked with a couple of very interesting people. You and Rosemary Clooney, and then you and Robert produced Wildman Fisher and Rosemary Clooney, so that's even more bizarre.
That's a long story. Rosemary was a very, very, very dear friend of mine. All of her kids and I, her son Miguel and I, wrote a lot of comic books together and played a lot of music together, and I was over at Rosemary's house a lot. My family spent probably 20 Christmas Eves at Rosemary's house. We were always with her. And she was just a great, great human being and a singular talent. What a singer. What a great singer. And what a strong woman and someone I admired very much. And it really wasn't that unusual. First time I wrote for Rosemary, it was brought to my attention that she was going into the studio to make a country record. So I co-wrote a song for her, and I said, well, what do you think about this? And it was written specifically for her from her perspective. I knew her well, and I knew things that she might like, and she loved the song. That was the first song that I wrote for Rosemary that she recorded.
Roses in the Garden.
Roses in the Garden. Paul Gordon and I, who were in Redwood together, wrote that. Several years later, probably more than 10, again, she was going into the studio. She wanted to do a lot of new material, not just classic stuff that had been heard before, and I wrote a couple of songs for her, and one ended up being the title track of that record called Still on the Road. Another one I think she recorded but didn't make the final list on that album. And changing subjects, changing gears to the Wildman Fisher part of that relationship, Rosemary was a very sensitive woman and a very loving and nurturing woman. Used to take in people. Like the friends of her kids would stay there for months at a time, and she'd give people sanctuary. She listened to some of the Wildman Fisher stuff that Barnes & Barnes had produced, and she was very moved by Wildman Fisher, as would anyone be who gave him a listen. I mean, he's a unique, one-of-a-kind artist. Yes, he was a manic-depressive, paranoid schizophrenic who sang a cappella, and there was a Frank Zappa discovered talent on the Sunset Strip in the late 60s. But I thought Wildman Fisher was brilliant, and Rosemary heard some of his stuff and was deeply moved by it, and she talked to him on the phone. He was a transient who would never stay put for more than a month or two anywhere at a time because he would get paranoid, so he would go from one hotel in one city to another hotel in another city and just keep moving around because he was uncomfortable in the world. And he would call Rosemary. She gave him her number, and he would call, and they would talk. And she said to me one day, it was after Christmas Eve, she used to call and sing him White Christmas on Christmas Eve. Anyway, she said to me, I think Larry would really love to record a song with me. And I said, well, yeah, he would. And she said, and I think you should write that song, and it should be called It's a Hard Business, because that's all he ever says. And I said, I don't think you want to do that, Rosie. I don't think you want to record with Larry. And she looked at me, she goes, yeah, I do. It'll make him really happy. I do. I said, okay. So Barnes & Barnes wrote this song, It's a Hard Business, and we demoed it, and we brought the demo to Rosemary, and she said, I love it. It's perfect. Let's do it. We set up 2 vocal mics in my studio. We went and got Wildman Fisher from Skid Row in downtown L.A., and Rosemary came in from her Beverly Hills mansion, and they stood opposite each other, and I thought, boy, this could just be a Twilight Zone. And it was smooth as can be. It couldn't have gone better. I think we had the whole song vocally wrapped up and finished in less than an hour. It was a high point for Wildman Fisher, and Rosemary was very generous and very happy to have given him that gift.
All right then, Bill, we'll leave it there. There's heaps and heaps and heaps we can talk about, but unfortunately time is not on our side.
Well, it's been a pleasure strolling down memory lane here, and I appreciate you sharing the new music.
No worries, Bill. And we didn't get time, unfortunately, to talk about all your involvement with America, who were quite a big band here in Australia. Lots of hits, and I think they came to visit us.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll have more to talk about next time.
Yeah. All right, Bill, I want to thank you very much for taking time to talk with us.
Thank you kindly. Cheers.